This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I normally rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. Today though, we're doing something a little bit different. I'm going to give you my picks for Magic's 10 most confusing cards. I did a top 10 on this very topic several years ago, but that list was entirely dominated by really old cards with really weird effects like Illusionary Mask and Ice Cauldron. For the most part, Magic's earliest days are the most confusing ones because they were doing all sorts of wacky things with cards at the time. However, it isn't only old Magic sets that feature confusing cards, so I wanted to do this as a part 2 of that particular top 10, but focusing only on cards that have been released in the era of modern Magic, in other words, the last 20 or so years of the game from the release of 8th edition to today. For a card to be confusing, it has to have an effect or templating that makes it very hard to understand what a card does on your first read, and generally, these are cards that take multiple reads to really figure out, and even then, there's a chance you end up playing them incorrectly. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with my picks of the 10 most confusing cards in Magic. At number 10, I have an entire mechanic, Wish Effects. These made their debut back in Odyssey Block, but they go back to the well every so often, and there are several recent cards that let you get a card from outside the game, perhaps most notably Karn the Great Creator. Once you know what this effect means, it isn't especially complicated. The problem is the actual effect this card has doesn't match the text box at all. They say reading the card explains the card, but that doesn't work with Wish Effects. In reality, a Wish Effect only allows you to get a card from your sideboard. There was a time when you could also get cards from exile, but that's not true anymore, so this is something that the cards should just say. They should just say that you can get a card from your sideboard. I understand leaving the door open for casual players to do wackier things with wishes, but the text of these types of effects are just so misleading as they currently stand that I really think they need to be fixed. At number 9, I have Glacial Worm. For 5 generic and 2 green, it's a 9/5 trampler that can be cast while you're searching your library. That's a mechanically unique effect and a pretty cool one, but it doesn't actually make any sense within the game's rules that you can cast a card in this situation. This one is particularly amusing because Mark Rosewater answered 2 questions about this weird card earlier this year. One of them asked how the rules manager could possibly have approved Glacial Worm and didn't understand how it works within the rules, and Mark Rosewater's response? Don't tell anyone, but I don't think it does. Rules managers juggle a lot and it's easy to miss something. A few weeks later, someone else asked him why they didn't give the worm erratum so it does actually work. His response this time? Sometimes we do something that we retroactively realize we shouldn't have done. So, in short, according to Mark Rosewater, Glacial Worm doesn't really work within the rules and it should never have been printed. This one's kind of interesting because it probably makes more sense when you're new to Magic than it does when you know the ins and outs of the rules. It doesn't seem that strange that you can cast something when searching your library. I mean, just pay the mana to cast it and cast it, right? Well, the problem there is that there just aren't rules for casting cards from your library. Additionally, you have to cast Glacial Worm in the middle of a spell resolving. In other words, the worm lets you do something in the middle of the resolution of whatever search effect you're using. That's really confusing and unusual, and you can't wait for your search spell to resolve and then cast the worm, because by then it's too late. The reason that doesn't work within the rules is because normally you can't cast something from your library, and normally you can't cast something when only part of a card's effect has resolved, but that's exactly what Glacial Worm lets you do. Basically, it works because they said it does, despite directly contradicting various rules. At number 8, I've got another entire mechanic, Mutate. When this mechanic debuted in Ikoria, it was pretty hard to wrap your head around. The idea is that it lets you pay a cost to combine 2 creatures. The general principle of the mechanic is already fairly confusing because you have to keep track of what several cards do, and you have to make sure you're putting your Mutate creature where you want to in the stack of creatures, because if you do it wrong, you're either not getting the stats or the ability that you want. Basically, the mutated creature has the power and toughness of whatever's on top, and the text boxes of everything else in the pile. If that's where things ended, it would already be a complicated mechanic, but perhaps not one that made the list, but there's something particularly counterintuitive about Mutate. If you cast a spell for its mutate cost and are trying to mutate it onto another creature, your opponent destroying the target of the mutate does not mean you get 2 for 1, like you would if you were targeting it with most other things. Instead, it enters the battlefield as if you had cast it normally as a creature spell, instead of for the alternate cost. The thing that really bothers me about that aspect of mutate is that it's not stated anywhere in the reminder text. The only way you know it works that way is if you read the set release notes or someone who did release those notes told you about it. Another thing I've seen trip people up is the fact that you can counter mutate with Essence Scatter. The mutate creature is always a creature spell, even when you're mutating. At number 7, it's Mythos of Nethroi. This card could be fairly simple, but they went with some weird templating. For 2 generic and a black, it says, destroy target non-land permanent if it's a creature, or if green-white was spent to cast the spell. There really aren't that many words in the text box, but the words that are there are downright confusing. Having an if requirement after the words destroy target non-land permanent really baffles you the first time you read the Mythos. Don't tell me I can destroy a non-land permanent and then immediately tell me that's not always the case. It's better to just summarize how this works than it is to read the text, and anytime that's true, that's not good. Of course, that's true of pretty much everything on this list. In summary, the Mythos can destroy a creature, but if you paid green and white mana when you cast it, it can destroy any non-land permanent. At number 6, it's Dryad Arbor. This is another card that seems deceptively simple at first. It's a creature and a land. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal comes when you start thinking about how this card works as a result of being both a creature and a land. First, always remember that this has summoning sickness. Luckily, this is something in the reminder text, but it's still something people overlook. You cannot tap it for mana the turn you play it unless you give it haste somehow. But in addition to that weirdness, Dryad Arbor being a land means that it doesn't use the stack and it doesn't count as a spell. This means no one can respond in any way to you playing it. Basically, it's a weird mix of upsides and downsides as a result of its dual typing, and it isn't always immediately obvious how Dryad Arbor works. Things get extra confusing if someone's using the From the Vault version of the Arbor because they made it look way more like a land, and it doesn't have any reminder text. This has resulted in opponents being confused when they realize one of their opponents has a land that can actually block. That whole problem actually caused a rule change, where if you have the Arbor around, you can't just stick it under your other forests, you have to make it clear that it's in play. If that's not confusing, I don't know what is. At number 5, I've got Shining Shoal. For X generic and 2 white, the Shoal says, the next X damage that a source of your choice would deal to you or a creature you control this turn is dealt to target creature or player instead. Sounds simple, right? It lets you redirect damage to something else. That's an effect we see all the time, right? Well, no, not the way that Shining Shoal does it anyway. I've seen this one confuse a ton of players, and I've probably seen people play Shining Shoal incorrectly on Magic Online more than just about any other card. This is because the specifics about how Shining Shoal redirects damage are just weird. It doesn't work the way that other damage redirection spells do. Usually, you end up targeting a damage source and or a thing that's going to be dealt damage, but that's not true here. The spell technically only has a single target, and that's the creature or player you redirect the damage to. It doesn't target the source that you are preventing damage from, nor does it target the creature or player from whom you are redirecting the damage. So when you cast the Shoal, never use the word target for anything other than where you want the damage to go, otherwise things are not going to go the way you planned. At number 4, I've got Saron of Min Colors. Let's go ahead and just read Saron of Min Colors' triggered ability. It says, whenever you cast your second spell each turn, each opponent mills 2 cards. When one or more cards are milled this way, exile target enchantment, instant, or sorcery card with equal or lesser mana value than that spell from an opponent's graveyard. Copy the exiled card. You may cast that copy without paying its mana cost. So, the part of this card that tends to confuse people are the words, with equal or lesser mana value than that spell from an opponent's graveyard. What spell is it even talking about? Is it talking about the cards that Saruman mills? Is it talking about the card you exiled? Well, no, it's referring back to the second spell that you cast during your turn. When you really think about it all, it makes sense. Cards that are in the graveyard generally aren't referred to as spells. Usually, it has to be on the stack to be a spell. So of course, it has to be that second card you cast because it is on the stack. But that's far from obvious the first time you read Saruman, even for the most seasoned of players. Saruman takes multiple reads, and even then you're often going to be better served by explaining this to your opponent instead of actually reading the card, which, as I've said, is a pretty huge problem. At number 3, I've got Brina the Demag. This 3-mana 1/3 flyer has a rather complicated ability that has a similar problem to Saron of Min Colors, where the trigger checks a whole bunch of stuff, and things are even more complicated because it affects multiple players and checks for some very specific things. It says, whenever a player attacks one of your opponents, if that opponent has more life than another of your opponents, that attacking player draws a card and you put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature you control. One confusing thing here is the use of opponent. An opponent is everyone but you in a game, but the weird thing is that Brina can benefit another attacking player who is also your opponent, provided the life totals line up correctly by drawing them a card. Brina never considers the attacking player's opponent though, only yours. So basically, anytime a player attacks one of your opponents and not you, Brina checks to see if that opponent being attacked has more life than any of your other opponents. It doesn't check your life, but it can check the attacking player's life. Then, that attacking player draws a card if life totals line up correctly. That part of the card on its own is really confusing, but Brina also adds a cherry on the top, because she also gives one of your creatures 2 +1/+1 counters if those life totals line up correctly. That part wouldn't be especially confusing on its own, but the fact that Brina's draw trigger can potentially benefit any attacking player, and the +1/+1 counter part can only ever benefit you, adds another complicated layer to a card that's already kind of a mess. At number 2, I've got Sphinx of the Second Sun. For 6 generic and 2 blue, the Sphinx is a 6/6 flyer and it has a very weird ability. It says, at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, you get an additional beginning phase after this phase. So, first off, there really aren't very many Magic cards out there that even refer to a beginning phase, so that's already some terminology that might trip you up a little bit. There is reminder text letting you know what exactly your beginning phase is, but even once you understand that, the way Sphinx of the Second Sun actually works confuses players all the time. On first read, most players seem to think that you get to untap your lands and draw and then have your post-combat main phase. After all, the effect says it triggers at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, right? It says so right on the card. Well, that's why you have to keep reading. While the first part of the ability does say at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, the last part of the ability says after this phase. So you get this beginning phase sandwiched in between the end of your second main phase and your end step. In other words, once you complete your second main phase, you get to untap and draw, but then you go right to your end phase. This means you can't do anything at sorcery speed. This would have made way more sense if it just said at the end of your post-combat main phase you get an extra beginning phase, although even then, I think the way the ability works would confuse people. Finally, I think the presence of a line break in the middle of the ability also leads to some confusion because it doesn't really feel like the ability should have any additional words after the second line. So yeah, Sphinx of the Second Sun is confusing as heck. Make sure you and your opponents aren't making the Sphinx even better than it already is by also giving people that extra main phase. Sphinx of the Second Sun might be super confusing, but I think there's one card that's even more challenging to understand, and that card is Wheel of Misfortune. At first glance, you can see that this has a text box that is completely packed. You might think that with that many words, they could fit some in there that would make the card make some sense, but that's not really the case. In fact, the Wheel's text box feels like something right out of a silver-bordered set. For 2 generic and a red, Wheel of Misfortune is a sorcery, and it says, each player secretly chooses a number 0 or greater, then all players reveal those numbers simultaneously and determine the highest and lowest numbers revealed this way. Wheel of Misfortune deals damage equal to the highest number to each player who chose that number. Each player who didn't choose the lowest number discards their hand, then draws 7 cards. So, yeah, Wheel of Misfortune makes you play a minigame, and it can have 3 outcomes. You get a wheel effect, you take damage, or nothing happens. The confusing part is determining who gets what, and the text box doesn't really help you figure that out unless you've read it like 10 times. In the end, highest number means you take damage, lowest number gets nothing, and the people in between get the wheel effect. One of the things that most frequently confuses players is that they think everyone paying 0 life means everyone takes no damage and gets to wheel, but it doesn't. That's because 0 ends up being both the lowest and highest number, so no wheel effect happens and no damage is dealt. That's just one of the many confusing situations that Wheel of Misfortune can create. If you ever cast this card in Commander, you're going to spend about 10 minutes trying to explain to everyone how the card works, and there's probably going to be some arguments about it too. That's why I think it comes in at number 1 on this list. So, those are my picks for the 10 most confusing cards in Magic. If you're interested in confusing your opponents, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.